Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to Beloit College, and welcome to our 15th annual Weissberg Chair and Human Rights Address. We're particularly honored to be joined by our new friend and current Weissberg Chairholder, James Anaya, the Regents, and James L. Lunar, Professor of Human Rights Law and Policy at the University of Arizona's James E. Rogers College of Law. If you have not been to many campuses, you might think that every school has the equivalent of a Weissberg week. You might think that such a smart idea, namely bringing someone to campus to interact with faculty, students, and staff, someone with a worldwide reputation for promoting core issues of human rights, someone with a proven record of stimulating effective change in a world too often antagonistic to such change, bringing someone to campus who have lived such a life of purposeful consequence, bringing someone to campus not for an arm's length visit, a drive-by lecture, a collect my speaker's fee and on to the next college, to bring someone to campus for a full contact tour of duty. You can sleep next week, tour of duty. You might think that such a smart, albeit gravity-defying idea would be everywhere, at Lawrence, at Williams, at Middlebury, at Yale, but you would be wrong. Only Beloit College has a Weissberg Week. In a world in need of so much attention and endurance and energy aimed at human rights, in a world of haves and have nearly nothings, on a globe where indigenous rights are regularly ignored and too often trampled, in such a world there are few willing to confront such towering odds and tactile injustice. Few who have waded into these waters and back out with strength left and lessons to share, but those few who do, they disproportionately find their way here. Well, not so much find, but are found and flown to Chicago and then picked up and driven to this place full of eager people willing to listen, to learn, but also, I hope, to teach. Professor Anaya will be the judge, but we don't just take. I hope. I don't think so. I hope the balance of trade between Beloit College and you, Professor Anaya, has not been only one-sided. For the Weissberg program isn't just about having Professor Anaya here. It is about luring him here to meet with students, faculty, and staff who are ready for him, to learn from him, and to teach him and each other. Students like Ren Lucas and Devin Mandel and Namunga Mantina and Allison Smith, 4 seniors who were this year's Weissberg Fellows. Or Guadalupe Angeles, Maria Bagnoli, Celine Castrucci, Hannah Devereaux, Madeline Hallberg, and Sabrina Sanchez, 2015 Weissberg Human Rights Grant recipients who have interned and been on the ground in Peru, India, Ukraine, Guatemala, and even St. Paul and Beloit, readying for a life of work in this field. And here tonight, the next crop, Lola and Hannah and Kunt and Meredith and Tessa and Macy, Weissbergers all here, preparing for next year, preparing for their roles as learners and teachers, preparing for lives of purposeful consequence because of the vision and support of Marvin and Nina Weissberg. This college is, for this week, frankly, better than anywhere else. We are so fortunate, Professor Anaya, to have you here this week, but I deeply hope that you feel fortunate to have had this week with us as well. And for that, we pause and thank two whom I just mentioned, Marvin and Nina Weissberg, the two whose vision, enthusiasm, and philanthropy makes this college and this world better. I know they are watching from afar. Thank you both. There are three others I want to recognize who also make this week possible each year. Our Manger Family Professor of International Relations, Beth Daugherty, our Director of International Education, Betsy Brewer, and our Associate Director of International Education, Josh Moore. It is their tenacity and focus on the importance of an undergraduate education at Beloit College that emphasizes the integration of internationalism into every department and program on campus, a mission that is at the heart of the Weissberg residency that helped earn Beloit College the Senator Paul Simon Award for Campus Internationalization. Please join me in thanking Beth and Betsy and Josh for developing and implementing a framework that makes the most of this precious opportunity and that promotes the mission of this great school so effectively. It's terrific to see so many of you here tonight. Let me turn over the podium to Professor Beth Daugherty, who will introduce our featured speaker and honored Weissberg Chairholder. Beth.
I would just like to echo Scott's thanks to everybody on the Weissberg Committee, and a special thank you to Faye Wassinger and Kut Har, who braved thunderstorms, flight delays, flight cancellations, and a tornado to safely deliver all of our panelists here last night. Professor James Anaya earned his BA from the University of New Mexico and a JD from Harvard Law School. He is Regents and James L. Lenore Professor of Human Rights Law and Policy at the University of Arizona, where he has taught since 1999. He teaches and writes in the areas of international human rights, constitutional law, and issues concerning Indigenous peoples. He also served on the law faculty at the University of Iowa from 1988 to 1999 and has been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, the University of Toronto, and the University of Tulsa. Prior to becoming a full-time law professor, he practiced law in Albuquerque, New Mexico, representing Native American peoples and other minority groups. For his work during that period, Barrister Magazine, a national publication of the American Bar Association, named him one of 20 young lawyers who make a difference. Among his numerous publications are his acclaimed book, Indigenous Peoples in International Law, and a widely used textbook, International Human Rights, Problems of Law, Policy, and Process. He participated in the drafting of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and was the lead counsel for a landmark case in which the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for the first time upheld Indigenous land rights as a matter of law. He served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples from May of 2008 to June of 2014. As Special Rapporteur, Professor Anaya monitored the human rights conditions of Indigenous peoples worldwide, addressed situations in which their rights were violated, and promoted practical measures to secure Indigenous peoples' rights, traveling frequently to meet with government officials and to visit Indigenous communities. Please join me in welcoming Professor James Anaya.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much. It's really great being here. President Scott Bierman, thank you for that welcome. Beth Daugherty, Betsy, Josh, thank you for all the hospitality you've shown me and for your hard work in making all of this possible. It's truly been an honor. I've so much enjoyed this week. Yes, it's been taxing in some ways on my time and to some extent energy, but I feel like I've benefited a great deal, and the balance, I think, has really gone my way, I must say, of the benefits and learning. At least that's the way I feel. And I'm so humbled. I'm not sure that's the right word, but at least I've really been impressed and touched by the way I've been treated here as someone who has contributed to human rights, and almost like a celebrity. I walk around, I go to the coffee shop, and people say, "I know you. I've seen your picture on the wall over there," you know. And when I get this kind of attention, I have to think of my kids who keep me in check, right? I remember the first time I came back from one of my missions as UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous Peoples. I had just been appointed by the Human Rights Council to this august job to go around and talk to governments, visit Indigenous peoples, talk to the media, then report back to the UN. And my first trip, like I said, was to Brazil. And when I was there, controversies happening, conflicts over Indigenous rights and claims and so forth. There was a lot of media attention on Indigenous peoples generally, and there was a lot of media attention on me and my visit. And everywhere I went, there was security, media. Even when I tried to go rest myself, in the bathroom or something, I was followed. And that went on for 2 weeks. And so when I got home, I got off the plane, and I remember walking outside the Tucson airport, and there was nobody. There was nobody. And it felt so great. So I go home, and I'm telling my family, my kids about this, that, oh my gosh, I've been under so much pressure, all this attention and media and so forth. I don't know how to deal with it. And my son taps me on the shoulder. He was 12 years old at the time. He taps me on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Dad. You're nobody here." So I'm glad to have been somebody here for a week. I'll be going back home tomorrow, where I'm sure my son will remind me again that I'm nobody there. But it truly has been a pleasure, and I am genuinely thankful for the opportunity that I've had to spend this week at this remarkable place, truly remarkable place. I am so pleasantly surprised. I didn't know what to think, really. I've spent time in the Midwest, of course. I was on the University of Iowa, as Beth said, for 11 years, but I had not spent time at a place as special as this, and to get to know the students, to see the interaction between the students and the faculty, and that learning that happens, that you can see building right in front of your eyes, and the enrichment that I've gotten from the interactions I've had. I feel very, very privileged to have been here this year. So I want to thank you, and thank you all the students, the faculty that I've had the privilege of interacting with, and of course thank the Weissbergs for their generosity in making this possible. I'm so honored to have been named the Weissberg Chair and to have served this week in that capacity. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the rights of Indigenous peoples in the contemporary world, and link those rights to what I like to refer to as the power of human rights ideas, but at the same time examine the challenges of implementing those ideas on the ground. It was in 2007 that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in an instant, the world went from a time when the Declaration, a document that affirms the rights of Indigenous peoples by the world community, by the most representative body of the states of the world, went from a time when that instrument was but an aspiration to a time when it was a reality, at least in terms of its affirmation by the United Nations system. I took this picture with my newly acquired iPhone. You might check the date, those of you who are aficionados of the iPhone, which came out in early September. Yes, I stood in line. And at that second, and I look at this picture and I still get emotional, because so many of us who had worked on the Declaration in one way or another, and I only had a very small Indigenous organization in certain of the aspects of the development of that instrument. But it really was a touching moment, and I remember when we passed from that moment when the Declaration was but an aspiration to when it was a reality, at least in terms of its affirmation by this world body. It took us into literally a new era, a time in which the rights were now recognized, these rights of self-determination, of Indigenous peoples' equality vis-a-vis other peoples in the world, a validation of the presence of Indigenous peoples and their cultures within the world, within the countries within which they live, a validation of those rights that have been claimed over lands and resources. That's what the Declaration represented, and not just now, it's an aspiration to have those rights recognized, but the very recognition of those rights. As you know, the General Assembly is as a world body, is the most representative body of the United Nations. Every state that's a member of the United Nations is represented on the General Assembly, and with that vote, an overwhelming majority of the states of the world expressed their support in favor of the Declaration. Now, there were a few states, 4 of them, that voted against the Declaration. You may guess which among them, but the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But it wasn't long before, and many of us predicted this would happen because the tide was in favor of greater recognition of Indigenous rights by the very fact of the affirmation of the Declaration. It wasn't long before, one by one, these states reversed course, at least in a formal sense, in terms of their position vis-a-vis the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And first of all, it was New Zealand reversed course and announced at the United Nations its support for the Declaration, then Australia, then Canada, then finally the United States. The United States in December of 2010 expressed through an announcement by President Obama before tribal leaders gathered at the White House its endorsement of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we can say now today that this declaration, this instrument, genuinely does represent a consensus of the world community in favor of the rights of Indigenous peoples. A document that, again, affirms these rights based on a recognition of the historical deprivation of those very rights that are affirmed, a recognition of the historical oppression that Indigenous peoples have suffered, and a call upon states to take specific and coordinated action to remedy those historical violations in accordance with the standards that are expressed in this instrument. Now, how was this achieved? How was it that the Declaration was achieved? Do Indigenous peoples have economic might, political power on the world stage? Certainly not military power in any significant way. How was the Declaration then achieved? It was achieved on the basis of a worldwide movement of Indigenous peoples themselves, that by the force of their voices caused the world to draw attention to their aspirations, to the expressions of aspirations, and to their accounts of the problems that they were encountering. Now, this Indigenous rights movement, which involves Indigenous peoples and their representatives from various parts of the world going to the United Nations, going to the media at the international level, making their voices known, has significant precedence. And Jeff Horntassel today at the panel referred to the Iroquois chief Daugherty, who went to the League of Nations in the 1920s to make an appeal on behalf of his people, the Iroquois people, specifically the Koyaga people within the Iroquois, an appeal of justice to the League of Nations for redress for the grievances of his people. Daugherty was claiming redress for the denial of the right of self-governance of his people, the supplanting of the authority structures in his territory. He believed that his people were genuinely a nation and deserved to be treated as such on the world stage. And so he went to this organization, the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, which was formed at the end of World War I, with the aspirations of providing a platform for the nations of the world to come together and resolve their grievances in a peaceable manner. He took at face value that promise of the Charter of the League of Nations, that it would welcome all peace-loving peoples into their circle in order to try to achieve peaceable resolution of their claims. So he went to the League of Nations in Geneva, where it was located, where its headquarters were. And he was received with a lot of curiosity. He was welcomed by many very warmly, but mostly with curiosity, and was not ultimately successful in gaining traction in favor of those claims, gaining genuine movement towards redress of those claims. The geopolitics of the time and the influence of Canada and also the United States blunted any chance of any real redress in favor of Desgahe's people. But nonetheless, he left a precedent, an imprint in the consciousness of Indigenous peoples that was then picked up later, such that in the 1970s, Indigenous peoples began appealing to the world community, to the United Nations in particular, in order for some kind of redress for their grievances. There was a historic conference in 1977 of non-governmental organizations organized around the theme of Indigenous peoples and discrimination in the Americas. And this non-governmental organization conference welcomed Indigenous peoples from throughout the Americas to discuss at the international level their concerns and to put forward their aspirations and to put forward ideas about how the international system, as it was then conformed and as it was coming into its form in the modern era, could possibly provide some kind of response to the concerns that they were expressing. One of the concrete results of these proposals that were made was the formation of the United Nations Working Group, that should be singular, Working Group on Indigenous Populations, within the human rights hierarchy or organizational structure of the United Nations system. This was a 5-member expert working group, meaning 5 experts named by the Subcommission on Promotion of Discrimination, promotion of protection against discrimination, of the Commission on Human Rights, a body below the Economic and Social Council, which was itself below the General Assembly. This, at the lowest rung of organization of the United Nations hierarchy or structure on human rights, was charged with the task of examining developments concerning Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas and around the world, of hearing the stories of Indigenous peoples and about their lives, about their histories, and about their concerns. It was also charged with the task of developing standards, of examining the desirability of developing standards concerning Indigenous peoples' rights that would be responsive to their concerns. Now, what's significant about the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, particularly, was that it opened its doors to participation by Indigenous peoples. So for the first time, Indigenous peoples had a formal forum at the United Nations by which to express their concerns, by which to hear from each other, as well as to voice their concerns before the United Nations and the states of the world in the United Nations. Now, this working group didn't have the power to make any decisions, to force any government to do any particular thing. It didn't have the power to itself adopt a declaration or an instrument that would have any binding authority upon states, but the power to bring interested parties, including Indigenous peoples, together to discuss the concerns of Indigenous peoples within a formal setting at the United Nations. As I said, to hear from Indigenous peoples about their particular concerns, to hear their stories about their histories, to hear their aspirations, and then on the basis of that to work toward the development of international standards that could be responsive to those. And this working group, hence, and the meetings it had on an annual basis, helped to catapult the Indigenous rights movement into ever more importance within the world stage and within the United Nations system itself. Other concrete results of the Indigenous rights movement and their appeals to the United Nations, including the formation of other mechanisms that would address Indigenous peoples' concerns. And among these was the formation in 2000 of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Whereas the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was, as I said, at the lowest rung of organization within the United Nations system. It was, like I said, below a subcommission of the Commission on Human Rights, which was itself below 2 other bodies within the United Nations hierarchy. The Permanent Forum was addressed as was created as a higher level forum for Indigenous peoples. And its composition was such that it would have among its membership representatives of Indigenous peoples or peoples from Indigenous communities. The Permanent Forum was formed as a subsidiary body of the Economic and Social Council, which is an intergovernmental body. The Permanent Forum, however, would be composed of 8 members, 8 from indigenous organizations or peoples, and 8 nominated by governments. It was to be a collegial body to address indigenous people concerns within the United Nations system. So since its first meeting in 2002, it has met on an annual basis for 2 weeks. It is becoming increasingly the most significant meeting of indigenous peoples from around the world. It is attended by upwards of 3,000 participants, including indigenous participants from around the world, and it remains a significant venue for indigenous peoples to come together and continue that discussion about their rights and continue to express their aspirations for a future that's distinct from the one of the past. Its main function, however, is not to make specific decisions about complaints that indigenous peoples may bring. Its main function is to influence the UN system itself, to coordinate action, to be responsive to indigenous people's concerns. It's a rather modest function, in fact, but nonetheless, the hope is that incrementally, that dialogue that happens at the permanent forum, the recommendations that come out of it to the UN system will help influence the UN system to be more responsive in its various activities to the concerns of indigenous peoples. Another mechanism that was created was the mandate of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is a mechanism that is attached now to the Human Rights Council, created by the predecessor to the Human Rights Council, which is the Commission on Human Rights. The Commission on Human Rights, like its successor, the Human Rights Council, is an intergovernmental body made up of governments of the world. It is the primary institution, the Commission was, and the Council is now, the primary institution charged with addressing human rights concerns within the United Nations system. And it has a series, the Council now has a series of these special procedures, as they're called, special rapporteurs, independent experts, sometimes other working groups that address various subjects of concern, various human rights subjects of concern. And among these now is the topic of indigenous peoples' rights. There are various special rapporteurs or independent experts that are named by the Human Rights Council, like I said, on various subjects of concern. There's a special rapporteur on violence against women, for example. There's a special rapporteur on the right to food, a special rapporteur on housing, and a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. That mandate having been created, like I said, by the Commission on Human Rights in 2001. The initial holder of this position was the distinguished anthropologist Rodolfo Staffenhagen. The position was carried over with the reforms in the United Nations that led to the replacement of the Commission on Human Rights by the Human Rights Council. And in 2008, I was named as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and held that position, as Beth Daugherty said, until June of last year. I held the position for 2 consecutive 3-year terms. And that position, it's charged with monitoring the conditions of indigenous peoples worldwide, engaging with governments, indigenous peoples themselves around specific problems of human rights, and promoting solutions to those specific problems, engaging in studies that are on topics of cross-cutting concern to indigenous peoples, such as the studies I did on extractive industries and indigenous peoples, the duty of states to consult with indigenous peoples, the issue of violence against indigenous women. These are topics that I took up in my term as Special Rapporteur, in addition to looking at specific situations concerning indigenous peoples. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur, as I said, is to engage governments, and one way of doing that is to visit countries, and not just around specific cases, but to see what governments are doing generally with regard to the indigenous peoples within their countries, what kind of laws and policies there are. So for 6 years, I engaged governments in various settings. I visited numerous indigenous communities carrying out these functions. This is the second of the major mechanisms now within the UN system focused specifically on indigenous people's concerns. The current mandate holder, I should add, is Ms. Vicky Tauli-Corpuz, who is from the Philippines, and she's been in this position for over a year and is focused on a range of issues, including issues of climate change, international financing and investment, and the effects of those on indigenous peoples and women's rights, among many other issues. A third mechanism that has been created, focusing specifically on indigenous people's concern, that is now functioning is the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Now, this was established in 2007, also by the Human Rights Council, so it is like the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is a mechanism of the Human Rights Council, one of the Human Rights Council's tools for addressing human rights, in particular the human rights of Indigenous peoples. Its function is to engage in research-based studies around particular topics that are assigned to it by the Human Rights Council. So it is engaged now in a range of studies, one on Indigenous peoples in education, one on Indigenous peoples in justice systems, one on the participation of Indigenous peoples in decision-making that affect them, and so on. It engages, like I said, in research-based studies. So we see now these three mechanisms existing. The old working group on Indigenous populations that I mentioned earlier no longer exists. It's been replaced by these mechanisms. But these are the mechanisms that now exist within the UN system that are specifically focused on Indigenous peoples' concerns, and that can be seen as a product of the movement of Indigenous peoples alongside the development and eventual adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So indeed, it is the case, we can see, that the Indigenous rights movement has had some success on the world stage, at least in terms of the development of a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which, as I said, represents the affirmation of Indigenous peoples' rights and their aspirations to maintain their distinct identities and exercise self-determination over their lands and territories, and also in terms of the creation of specific mechanisms within the UN system focused on Indigenous peoples' concerns. Now, what was the driving force behind the creation of these mechanisms? How did this movement, by virtue of what kind of power did Indigenous peoples achieve these important developments? And my thesis is that it is the power of their ideas, the power of the ideas building upon human rights ideas. Indigenous peoples were able to seize upon the idea of human rights and certain principles of human rights, general principles that touch upon our collective consciousness, that we each in one way or another are drawn to, and that represent our collective sense of justice. And when I say our, I mean our in a very broad sense. And one can say the world community in a sense, in one sense. Now I want to touch upon what I see as the main, or among the main, human rights ideas that Indigenous peoples were able to seize upon, and through this movement achieve these developments that I've described, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the establishment of these specific mechanisms. 5 interrelated ideas arising within the modern understanding of human rights. 1, equality. The United States Declaration of Independence declares that all men are created equal, that we hold these truths self-evident. The notion of equality being a self-evident truth. It exists not because it has been created by some philosopher. This idea is deemed to be inherent in the worth of all human beings, inherent in the very idea of what it means to be a human being. However, it took time for the notion of equality to embrace all segments of humanity, but the idea has been planted for some time. One can go back before the Declaration of Independence, of course, to a strong tradition of notions of equality. One can see it not just rooted in Western liberal thought, but in thinking throughout the globe for some time. But of course, notions of equality have evolved. With regard to Indigenous peoples, notions of equality were deployed not in recognition of Indigenous peoples' distinct identity, but with the sense that Indigenous peoples, if they were to be equal, had to abandon their distinct cultural identities. Nonetheless, Indigenous peoples seized upon this idea of equality and saw it not just as a matter of individual equality vis-a-vis others, but a matter of equality from the standpoint of group identity. One of the notorious examples of the denial of Indigenous identity, and hence Indigenous equality, of course, is, as Indigenous peoples have pointed out, the system of boarding schools in the United States or residential schools in Canada that we heard about this afternoon. This system was based upon the idea that Indigenous peoples and individuals, in particular to be equal, had to do with their distinct identities, that had to do away with those distinct cultural marks that made them different in order to be truly equal. The promise of equality was conditioned upon losing that distinct identity and joining society with the cultural markings of. Kill the Indian, save the man was the motto adopted by Captain William Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian School in the late 19th century, a school that took Indigenous people from their homes with this idea of purging them of their distinct Indigenous identities in the name of the equality of the individual. In Canada, the Indian Act of 1876 was developed within this philosophy of equality, of individual equality, and of purging Indigenous peoples from their distinct identities in the name of equality, individual equality. The Deputy Superintendent General of the Indian Department of Canada, Duncan Campbell Scott, said in 1920, "Our object is to continue until there is not an Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there will then be no Indian question and no Indian Department." All this in the name of equality. The termination era in the United States by which Indian tribes were to be terminated, at least their recognition by the federal government to be terminated, that we saw in the 1950s, in the middle part of last century, and the associated policies of termination, all were premised upon a notion of equality that denied distinct identity, but that held equality out as meaning full or equal citizenship of the Indigenous individual, is another representation of this brand of equality. But Indigenous peoples turned equality on its head. The Indigenous movement took this notion of equality and said, there's to be genuine equality. Equality needs to be understood in terms of the equality of our distinct cultures, of our distinct group identities. And hence the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples affirms in its first article that Indigenous peoples, communities, and individuals are equal to all other peoples and individuals. Embracing equality is a foundational principle, but not just the equality of the individual, the equality of Indigenous peoples as such, of all that makes up them, all that makes up their character as distinct peoples, as distinct societies. So the notion of equality, fundamental and foundational to the Indigenous rights movement, and one of those ideas that had power, that was understood as being foundational to the human rights of Indigenous peoples, but contextualized in favor of their own aspirations and demands. A related idea, human rights idea, cultural survival. With inherent human equality comes not just the equality of the individual, and the notion of individual worth being in terms of the notion of individual worth in that context, but also the equality of cultures. And so the idea of cultural survival that we find in human rights was claimed by Indigenous peoples themselves. It was not just the dominant culture that is to be able to survive, not just those cultures that originate in Western Europe, that are deemed to have the fine arts, that are deemed to be in an advanced state, but the cultures of other peoples of the world that are deemed to be, that Indigenous peoples claimed as equal to the cultures of others. So this notion of cultural survival was claimed by Indigenous peoples. And hence we see within the Declaration Indigenous peoples' distinct cultural identities affirmed in explicit terms, in terms of their own languages, their own religions, languages and religions that were denied to them throughout various points in history. In the residential schools, Indigenous children were denied the opportunity to speak their language, hence, indeed, they were punished for them. And not just in the residential schools in Canada, the boarding schools, but also in everyday life. Indian agents in the reservations suppressed the speaking of language. The educational system more broadly discouraged the speaking of language. Indigenous religious practices were discouraged, if not outright prohibited. Indigenous cultural identities generally were discouraged, if not prohibited. They were made relevant only, for the most part, in museums and in folkloric manifestations for the benefit of others to look on with curiosity, but not encouraged as continuing as a genuine part of life. So what we see the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples doing is affirming that Indigenous peoples' cultures and all that makes up those cultures are valuable, and that those cultures are equal in value to those of others. We also see the Declaration taking an expansive view on what culture is. It is not just those aesthetic manifestations, it's not just language and religion, although it is those as well. It is all those elements of Indigenous life that make up a distinct cultural identity, including economic and social patterns, including relationships with lands and territories. And so the Declaration understands the spiritual value that lands, territories, and resources has to Indigenous life, and affirms those connections that Indigenous peoples have to the lands and territories in terms of the importance to Indigenous peoples of their cultural identities. It makes explicitly that connection so that lands and territories are not just economic commodities or of material worth. They're valuable in terms of the cultural identities and survival of the cultures of Indigenous peoples, building, again, on the notion of equality of cultures. In regard to lands and resources, that claim of Indigenous peoples is reinforced by the idea of property. Now, the idea of property, I was long told, is a Western liberal concept and doesn't have any room for Indigenous people's conceptions of a relationship with things. I was told in law school that because Indigenous peoples didn't have a conception of property, that the dominant society could simply take Indigenous people's lands, and Indigenous peoples would be okay because of that absence of any real conception of property. But if one takes seriously the notion of equality, one takes seriously the notion of culture, one sees that Indigenous peoples do have a conception of property, of relationship with things. It's just different. It's just different. It's not individuated as the Western liberal concept does. John Locke said that there is no property interest perfected unless the land is made in land, unless it is put to productive use. And so he looked out across the American landscape from his perch in England and said, there are no perfected property interests that the natives have. Rather, these wandering hordes of savages roam over the land as opposed to put it in productive use. And by those utterances, he then justified the taking of Indigenous peoples' lands. And even those of us who would advocate of Indigenous peoples, in favor of Indigenous peoples decades later, would look at the concept of property as hostile because of that pedigree and see it almost as irrelevant. But upon reflection, what the Indigenous movement helped to generate was a reclaiming or a claiming of this concept of property that we find in the law, that we find in human rights for Indigenous peoples, taking into account these other ideas of equality and culture. The idea being that if property is a human right, it needs to be understood in universal terms. If culture is a human right, the cultural perspective that one brings to the concept of property needs to come to the fore. And hence, the Declaration recognizes Indigenous peoples' own concepts of property and land tenure systems, and affirms then that Indigenous peoples have the rights to their traditional lands on the basis of their own customary land use patterns or property systems. There are precedents within the Inter-American system for the protection of human rights that track these aspects, these parts of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Mention was made in the introduction to my involvement in a case that went to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the case of Awastini versus Nicaragua. This case came before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights well before the Declaration was adopted, well before there was a formal instrument to be invoked in an international human rights proceeding to claim Indigenous peoples' rights and lands and resources. But the community of Austini couldn't wait for the declaration to be adopted. There was a logging concession that had been granted for logging on its territory. Its lands were being invaded, and so in defense of those lands, it invoked this notion of property within the proceedings of the Inter-American system. When I was brought in to look at the potential for bringing a case on behalf of the community, I had to advise the community, look, if we're going to go before the Inter-American system or any other international system, we have to recognize that we don't, at this point in time, and this was in the 1990s, don't have a whole lot to go on in terms of formal instruments, formal documents. But we do have general human rights instruments. We had at the time the American Convention on Human Rights, which in its Article 21, tracking Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, says that everyone has the right to his property. That's the wording of the American Convention on Human Rights. Everyone has the right to his property. Many fellow lawyers, colleagues with whom I conferred about the possibility of using that provision to defend the customary or traditional land rights of Austini were very skeptical of doing that. I was reminded of the Western liberal origins of the notion of property. I was reminded of what John Locke had said about property and about how it was a limiting conception and had been used indeed against Indigenous peoples' claims. But with little options, having failed in the domestic legal system, and having challenged my colleagues to come up with a better theory, and they're not having come up with a better one, this is the one we went with. That this right to property had to be understood in an intercultural sense, had to be understood not just from the standpoint of the formal Nicaraguan property system, but had to be understood from the standpoint of the indigenous community concerned. And so we got our anthropologists, we sent them out into the field, we had them study the system of property of the Austini community and document what it was. And they were able to document for us that indeed there is a system of property, a system of land ownership within the community. Maybe not ownership in the same way, but a system that determines what families farm where, under what conditions, how you transfer those interests and where you farm, how it's determined which family lives in which area, how inheritance happens when someone dies, how plots of land get passed on to others. A property system, not like the Nicaraguan, but a property system. And so we put that system before the court with our expert anthropologists, and of course with the testimony of the indigenous peoples themselves and the leaders themselves. And the indigenous leaders also talked about the spiritual and cultural significance of this land too. It wasn't just a commodity that was useful to their physical survival. It was the core of their existence, as they described it. It was where the spirit beings that shaped their lives in so many ways lived. And so they made a powerful case to the court. I say they, I mean, I feel like I was just sitting there, sort of facilitating the dialogue, facilitating that marvelous testimony to the court that allowed the court to see that there was a property system, if it could only open their eyes beyond the classic liberal view of what property is. And it was to the credit of the indigenous leaders and our marvelous expert testimony, the anthropologists and the geographers, that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights did ultimately see that there was indeed an alternative property system. And applying these other ideas of equality and culture in association with property, the court could not help but see that this idea of property could only affirm the property rights of indigenous peoples. And hence this idea contributed to the recognition of indigenous peoples' own land tenure systems and their rights over lands and resources according to their own terms, such that even if they don't have beforehand a recognized title to their land granted by the state, they have rights under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And those rights imply a duty upon the state to recognize those lands as theirs if it hasn't already. Now, an overarching idea is that of self-determination. Self-determination finds itself in the United Nations Charter as a foundational principle. All peoples have the right to self-determination, say the two major UN human rights instruments, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The right of self-determination was the normative grounding for the decolonization movement that resulted in the independence of states in Africa and parts of Asia and elsewhere in the world. Indigenous peoples claimed this right of self-determination as peoples. It was resisted for years by states, that is, recognition of Indigenous peoples' self-determination, because states couldn't get out of this state-centric frame of thinking in relation to self-determination. Oh, if self-determination is granted, that means then they form their own states. Well, that's not what we were talking about, really. What Indigenous peoples made clear over time was that they were talking about self-determination as a human rights idea, as that basic idea that is grounded in human nature to want to live those aspirations that one develops, both individually and collectively. It has to do with that right to translate aspiration into reality, that right to determine one's own destiny on a continuing basis, one that transcends notions of contemporary political organization, one that can be imagined as having relevance in all spheres of life, no matter what the political configuration is. A human rights idea that isn't wedded to the institutions of the state, which really have Western origins in Europe, but that have to do with the way communities are able to form and exist and to make the choices that are meaningful in their lives. And that was the idea that Indigenous peoples were claiming within this movement. And that is the idea that is ultimately affirmed in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in that particular context of Indigenous peoples and the aspirations as they express. So Article 3 of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples says explicitly, mirroring the language of other human rights instruments, that all Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they determine their political, economic, and social status. Self-determination being a powerful idea that Indigenous people seized upon and finds itself as foundational to the Declaration. The idea of economic and social justice. Numerous international instruments speak of economic and social justice. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights lays out a series of rights of economic and social justice, beginning with the right to physical well-being, the right to housing, the right to work and to maintain a decent living, and so forth. It's, of course, well known that Indigenous peoples typically, and indeed one could say that it's a characteristic of Indigenous peoples around the world, that they are disadvantaged economically and in terms of basic indicators of human wellness and welfare, such that in the United States and Canada, and really throughout the Americas, other parts of the world, Indigenous peoples are the poorest among the poor, have the highest rates of infant mortality typically, the highest rates of diseases that are curable quite easily, typically, the lowest levels of attainment of formal education and so forth, highest rates of suicide. One could go through the various indicators of social and economic well-being and seeing Indigenous peoples, again, disadvantaged in relation to each of these indicators. We heard this afternoon about the particularly troubling phenomena of violence against Indigenous women that we see in this country, in Canada, and indeed in other places of the world. Economic and social justice is an idea that is embedded now, and has been for some time, within our conceptions of universal human rights. And it is an idea that was claimed by Indigenous peoples in the movement for recognition of their rights that we see resulting in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the Declaration has a number of provisions by which states are to take decided action in coordination with Indigenous peoples to address the economic and social disparities they face, with attention to their distinct cultures and ways of life. Now, overarching each of these distinct human rights ideas is the very idea of human rights, the idea that rights are inherent, that they do not exist because they are given by temporal authority, but that they are inherent in humanity and arise by virtue of the very nature of human beings. But as we talk about these ideas and the overarching idea of human rights and their contextualization in relation to Indigenous peoples, as we see manifest in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we look across the globe and we see, as we heard again this afternoon, there are still many problems. In fact, one might even say that this affirmation of Indigenous peoples' rights that we see in the Declaration is not at all reflected in the reality of Indigenous peoples. That indeed not much has changed since this Declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly. And so today, the challenge that is faced within the Indigenous rights movement, and indeed I would say by all concerned about human rights, is the challenge of implementation. The challenge of seeing these rights implemented. The challenge of seeing these rights translated into reality in the everyday lives of Indigenous peoples. Now, what are the major elements of this challenge? What are the major impediments to implementation? One, lack of awareness among public actors or among government officials. The acceptance that we see of the Declaration by states as manifested by its adoption by the General Assembly, that acceptance, I spoke of a consensus among states, but that consensus, that acceptance by states and by the governments of the world is quite thin, I believe. In my experience as Special Rapporteur, when I went around the world just meeting with government officials at all levels, I would find that the diplomats, of course, in Geneva and in New York, they were well-versed in these human rights ideas. Many were well-versed in the Declaration, could repeat the provisions of the Declaration even. They could even tell me about certain initiatives their governments were taking in favor of the Declaration or along the lines of the Declaration. But when I would go to different countries and meet with government officials at the operation level, those government officials that were in charge of the natural resource sector, for example, in granting out concessions to oil companies or mining companies, those government officials in charge of education programs, health programs, Indigenous rights, what? Declaration, what? Not much awareness about it. And how can we expect there to be implementation if public officials whose functions touch upon those aspects of Indigenous people's lives that the Declaration and these norms speak to aren't aware of these norms, aren't educated in the issues, aren't educated about the standards that are to be followed when it comes to the rights of Indigenous peoples. So the lack of awareness among public actors, among government officials, is an issue, is an ongoing problem that needs to be addressed. And so as Special Rapporteur, in my meetings and my dealings with governments and in my recommendations to the Human Rights Council and the governments there, I advocated for campaigns, greater educational campaigns and programs that would reach public officials at all levels and not just those who operate in the international sphere and in the world of human rights internationally. A second challenge or impediment is that, of course, of competing economic and political forces. The competing economic and political forces that are thirsty for resources. And many of those resources, the world's remaining resources, of course, natural resources, are Indigenous peoples' territories. And with those economic and political forces, of course, comes power. And in many instances, that power carries the day over following relevant human rights standards. These competing economic forces are real, and strategies need to be developed about how they can be redirected, reharnessed, in order to come into line themselves with human rights more generally and the rights of Indigenous peoples in particular. Then thirdly, regulatory inertia. Regulatory inertia. If we speak only about Indigenous peoples' land rights, we see a lot of complexities in relation to the way that states regulatory apparatuses work with regard to lands and natural resources. They simply don't, in many countries, incorporate this notion of indigenous peoples' own property systems. They operate as if they don't exist. They and distribute lands among people without regard to these systems, and they have for a long time, without regard to indigenous peoples' concepts of property. Turning those regulatory systems in favor of indigenous peoples is no easy task. It requires a lot of technical capacity brought to the public officials that might be in charge. It requires reforms in legislation, reforms in regulatory regimes. Changing the way the natural resources sector allows for resource extraction on indigenous people's lands or indigenous territories requires a lot of technical capacity at the regulatory level and a lot of reform. And the inertia that exists is a significant impediment towards doing that. That is, bureaucracies like to do things as usual. People know how to do what they've done for a long time. The regulations are in place. Officials are used to them. To try to now tell them to do something differently is hard. And like I said, requires technical capacity as well as know-how as well as will. So that's a significant impediment as well. But most fundamentally, there is the problem of attitudes within society more generally. Attitudes shared, I believe, by virtually all societies within which they live. And when I mean the societies, I mean the broader society. If we take American society, there's an attitude of otherness with regard to indigenous peoples, an attitude along the lines of what we heard about from Jeff Corntassel today that is represented by stereotypes, and attitudes that see indigenous peoples as, to the extent they continue to in today, oh, well, they're the rich casino owners. When I was Special Rapporteur, I told this to one of the classes, I did a review of the situation of indigenous peoples in the United States, and there were some news reports about my visit. And Fox News, actually it was Bill O'Reilly's program on Fox News, picked up upon my visit. And in banter with Dennis Miller, who is featured on his show in a spot called Miller Time, Dennis Miller told Bill O'Reilly, he said, "Well, I don't think we should call them Native Americans anymore. They should be called the casino-owning Americans." And so the sense that indigenous peoples, there's something other than part of the society, the genuine parts of American society. And to the extent they are around us, they're these people who own casinos, and that's what they are. The sense of otherness has deep roots in the American consciousness. And to one extent or another, and like I said, it can be seen to exist in other societies, peoples are. At least in this country, it has what I've just identified as two variants. One is this imagery of the vanquished savage who stood in the way of development. This is that savage that we learned about, and I say we because I did too, in elementary school. That was in the way of manifest destiny, that was destined to vanish and succumb to the superior power and might of the colonizers, and hence should have vanished, as indeed in the American consciousness this savage did. And again, to the extent there are descendants of the vanquished savage, well, they are not really within the American identity that prevails in the majority consciousness, to the extent they cling to what was vanquished. The promise of equality that, again, as I said earlier, that is to be held out to them is one that comes with simply becoming Americans like others and succumbing to that dominant identity. A second Charles Dickens, I think the Victorian-era writer, British writer, from his perch in Great Britain, represented this notion of the vanquished savage in his attitude, which is represented in this excerpt from his writing. My feeling, he said, is that if we have anything to learn from the Indian, it is what to avoid. His virtues are a fable, his happiness a delusion, his nobility nonsense. We have no greater justification for being cruel to the miserable object than for being cruel to a William Shakespeare or an Isaac Newton. But he passes away before an immeasurably better and higher power, i.e. that of Christianity, than ever ran wild in any earthly woods. And the world will be all the better when this place knows him no more. The world is better when the place knows him no more, the vanquished savage. Then there's the noble savage, a second variant. The noble savage. This is the one Americans like, that dominant consciousness likes. The noble savage who remains something in the past, romanticized in the past, and to the extent that the descendants of that past noble savage remain, they too remain noble, but still apart from the mainstream. Now, many of you will remember, I'm looking at the people who are my age or older, this public service announcement, I think it was in the 70s, that was on television. And it showed this Indian, right? Well, he's not really an Indian, he's an actor, an Italian actor, who played an Indian. He went by the name of Iron Eyes Cody. And there he is in this public service announcement paddling down a river, it's a pristine river, beautiful nature all around him. And he turns a bend, and then there's this factory billowing smoke, and the river becomes polluted. And the camera pans towards his face, so the picture closes in on his face, and you see a tear, as you can see here, going down his cheek. And the narrator says, some people revere nature, and love it for what it once was. Others don't. All in the past, right? Love it for what it once was. And others, people make pollution. People can fix it. So an appeal to the imagery of the noble savage, to those better lights in all of us that can be connected to the noble savage, but nonetheless the noble savage who once was. And to the extent he remains, he is this relic going up a river in the northwest someplace who's out of place. That's the image you ultimately see. This out-of-place Indian guy, Italian guy, so maybe he's really out of a place, who can't find his way because he's too noble. There's all this modernity around him, and he's just completely out of place. That's the Indian. That's the Indian, the noble savage, something that's other than what is within the proper conception of the American identity. So what there is, I believe ultimately, is a need for public awareness that embraces, one, understanding Indigenous peoples as part of contemporary life, genuinely understanding Indigenous peoples as part of contemporary life, and for what they are, not as relics of the past or something outside of American life or life of the society within a country, but as part of the life of the country. Secondly, a common cross-cultural Indigenous identity. Now, I've gotten into trouble with this one, because what I'm saying here is that there needs to be a cultural sharing, a genuine cultural sharing between Indigenous peoples and the dominant society. Now, Indigenous peoples have seen many aspects of their cultures plundered, misappropriated, and abused. And so naturally, there is an impulse among Indigenous people to say, no, just stay away. We'll do our culture and no sharing, because we know what that leads to. But at some level, that needs to be overcome on both sides, so that the dominant society doesn't just see Indigenous culture as something to appropriate and profit from, so that eventually Indigenous peoples can be become genuinely comfortable in sharing that culture in appropriate ways. And with that, I believe there can genuinely be a cross-cultural understanding, so that the children of the future can see themselves as connected with each other, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, as genuinely part of the same society and political community, not as entirely separate, but with, of course, that understanding of distinctiveness and distinctiveness. Many people think that the claim for distinct cultural identity is a claim for separation. And I don't. I think it's the basis for understanding. If one doesn't have intact their own culture and moorings in that, there can never really be a basis for sharing among different peoples. And if there isn't that mutual respect for that distinctiveness and that difference, there can never be really an equilibrium. And that's what I think we're sorely lacking in this country and many others, a common sense of cross-cultural Indigenous identity, a sense of Indigenous identity that is shared by the broader society in a positive way. And I'm not talking about dominant society having mascots. I'm not talking about wearing Chief Yahoo on a baseball cap. That is not sharing in Indigenous society. That's the misappropriation. That's the abuse. I'm talking about a real, genuine sharing. And then thirdly, the mainstreaming of education about Indigenous peoples. Jeff Corntassel was talking about the high school textbooks and how Indigenous people disappeared around the beginning of the 1900s in the account of history. And to the extent they reappear in the account of history, it's in the 90s with a depiction of Indian people as those casino-owning Indians. Our children in schools generally are not being taught about history from a cross-cultural standpoint. Indigenous peoples' realities are not in the mainstream of education. They are on the fringes of it. And worse, there is a misrepresentation about Indigenous peoples within that history. There needs to be a real reckoning by history and by the accounts that are given of history in education about Indigenous peoples. And not just in terms of history, in terms of in relation to all spheres of relevant education, literature, the arts, the contributions of Indigenous peoples to sciences, to agriculture, and so forth. This is fundamental, I believe, because what we're talking about here is a multi-generational project. You know, this kind of social change that I'm talking about here isn't going to happen in a few years. And it might not even happen in a generation or two. It's something that is going to take time. And educating children in this way is fundamental to this kind of change that I'm talking about. Now, if we consider what all I've been saying, it's kind of easy to be a little pessimistic. I mean, we see all these challenges, right? And I've sort of worked myself into a kind of pessimism here as I've talked about all these things. But I began talking about an Indigenous movement that had achieved remarkable successes, if only in terms of a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the development of certain institutions focused upon Indigenous peoples' concerns. So I think what we can do to get ourselves out of the funk of the challenges of implementation is maybe go back to these successes and rethink what were some of the key elements leading toward those successes. Now, the last speech I gave, or major address I gave to the United Nations, to one of the United Nations bodies, led me to think about this, and I put down some thoughts about that. What is it that led to some of these positive developments that we can maybe seize upon as we think about how to meet these challenges So I want to share with you some of the thoughts that I conveyed at that time. What I see is a number of characteristics, 3 particular characteristics of the Indigenous rights movement that animated the movement and helped it to move forward towards particular successes. First, the Indigenous rights movement has been enlightening. It has been a force to enlighten and educate. Educate about the presence of Indigenous peoples in the world today, about their conditions, aspirations, and contributions. A force to make known that Indigenous peoples are not just historical figures to be relegated to images of savagery or romanticism. Indigenous peoples and their allies have used various means, including advocacy, the media, the courts, academic platforms, the arts, and international forums to raise awareness about the present-day manifestations of historical oppression that Indigenous peoples continue to suffer, as well as about what they bring to the world's rich cultural mosaic and knowledge. This enlightenment has been an essential precondition for mobilizing social and political forces to recognize Indigenous peoples and their rights. Yet, as I found in my work as Special Rapporteur, there is still a great deal of ignorance in the world about Indigenous peoples, and that ignorance continues to breed attitudes that resist needed change. I'm convinced that more, broader, and deeper enlightenment and education are needed to bring about the kind of social and political climate that will yield more decisive steps toward operationalizing the rights that are enshrined in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. A second element of the Indigenous rights movement that has animated progress is a pragmatic tendency, a tendency to be pragmatic and constructive in the search for solutions that are grounded in fundamental principles. This principled pragmatism can be seen in the historical treaty-making by Indigenous nations by which they sought to reach arrangements that were both respectful of their sovereignty and accommodating to the presence of European settlers. It can also be seen at work when Indigenous peoples moved to gain access to the United Nations in the 1970s within existing limitations of participation, eventually to gain a permanent presence at the United Nations in the form of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and other institutions. Pragmatism and constructive problem solving will undoubtedly be key to the success of continuing efforts to gain greater participation within the United Nations. In more local settings, as Special Rapporteur, I saw numerous instances in which Indigenous peoples have been able to use existing domestic legal arrangements to their advantage, despite flawed or weak aspects of those legal arrangements. And in doing so, build precedents and practices that are ultimately conducive to the exercise of their rights. In their pragmatism, Indigenous peoples and their allies have known to distinguish principle from dogmatism, to distinguish enduring truths and rights from the conventions and doctrine that are transient and circumstantial. They have been creative and open to building common ground for peaceful coexistence and amicable relations. And a third and final characteristic of the Indigenous rights movement that I would like to mention is optimism. I believe optimism animated the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee chief Descahe, whom I mentioned earlier. When he traveled to the League of Nations in the 1920s, a response that could lead to justice for his peoples. Even though his efforts did not bear immediate fruit, that same optimism was present in subsequent efforts by Indigenous peoples to appeal to the international community. That same optimism allowed Indigenous peoples, once having gained a foothold in the United Nations, to propose and imagine a day in which there would be a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And that same optimism now helps drive the multiple efforts across the globe in multiple settings to see the rights enshrined in the Declaration made reality in Indigenous peoples' everyday lives. As I was welcomed by Indigenous communities in several countries into their homes and territories during my time as Special Rapporteur, I learned of their struggles and challenges. But at the same time, amid the struggles, I consistently saw optimism that looks beyond the present to a future, if only a better future. About 7 years ago, it was just about 7 years ago, when just after I'd been named Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples, another great Haudenosaunee chief, and he was mentioned this afternoon as well, Chief Warren Lyons of the Onondaga Nation. He came up to me at a UN meeting, and he expressed the optimism that is an important characteristic of the Indigenous rights movement, while at the same time reminding me of the tasks ahead. He looked at me and said, "Jim, we have a lot of work to do, but the wind is on our backs." And that statement remains seared in my memory still. And I look around and I continue to see challenges of all kinds for Indigenous peoples and others for whom a dignified life is elusive. We see suffering by many at home and in the far reaches of the globe. Yet amid these challenges and suffering, there is the idea of human rights, an idea that inspires us to focus on what's good in human nature, an idea that moves us to confront, talk about, educate, and overcome what is bad, an idea that stirs our imagination about how things can be better in a practical and pragmatic sense. And as Indigenous peoples have shown, this is a powerful idea that has taken hold in the global consciousness. So when I look around the world we live in, yes, I see innumerable problems for Indigenous peoples and others. But I can't help but feel that despite all these problems, the wind is on our backs. Thank you for your attention. Should I stay here? What?
The success of the Weissberg family vision is the attraction of a Weissberg resident scholar who draws energy and endurance from a community unabashedly and unreservedly enthused about the potential of learning so much from a full week of the person of such consequence. Our Weissberg scholars are international, interdisciplinary, and indefatigable. They are ministers of education, Pulitzer Prize winners, Constitutional Court justices, Chinese dissidents, directors of international organizations, ministers of finance, and now special rapporteurs. They live engaged in consequential lives. They have been engaged with consequential issues, engaged with consequential principles, engaged with consequential decision makers. And we have asked a shocking amount from Professor James Anaya. We have done so, we've asked so much because our students, our faculty, our community, we are hungry, voracious, ravenous for the knowledge these Weissberg chairs have to share. And our attention, Professor Anaya, has been riveted on you this week. Your time is well spent with this community. Marvin Weissberg's vision predicts this and demands this. You have been the embodiment, Professor Anaya, of Mr. Weissberg's vision. Over this week, you have been an exemplar of what it means to be a Weissberg Chair. In recognition and appreciation of you and your time here, it is my pleasure to present you with a token of our appreciation. This token, which includes an image that is particularly meaningful to this community, a turtle. Do you like turtles, Professor Anaya?
I do
Of course
now.
you do.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great.
This is an image that is intended to remind you every time you look at it that you are now a Beloiter. We claim you as a Beloiter, and we hope you embrace your future as a Beloiter. Please join me in recognizing and thanking our Weissberg Chair for 2014-15, Professor James Anaya.
Sure. Absolutely, yeah.
You might think that now you are done, but you're not. We're going to put you back to work. So Professor Anaya has agreed to take some questions from the audience. And Beth, can I ask you to serve as... students with, we have mics in the back, so thank you. So I see we have a question in the back, and I will turn the mic back over to the professor.
Hello. My name's Luca. I don't know. We did that earlier. Whatever. I was wondering, based on your experience in the U.S. Congress, is a major problem in supporting the rights and sort of discrimination or ending the discrimination against Indigenous peoples, is a major problem awareness or will in your experience with sort of the U.S. Congress over the past probably 10, 15 years?
I don't have a lot of experience with Congress myself, other than what I read mostly in the media. My work has been, to the extent I've done work as a lawyer, it's been in the courts for the most part in the United States, although I have dealt somewhat with Congress. But my view is, based on my observation from afar somewhere, is that it's both. You know, it is a lack of awareness by most members of Congress about the issues that we've been talking about, and about the absence of Indigenous peoples in American life, or a perception by them of an absence of Indigenous peoples from American life, an absence of awareness from specific concerns like the issue of violence against women. I think what happened recently in Congress, the difficulty with getting a simple amendment to the Violence Against Women Act, which would allow for courts to have tribal courts to have some jurisdiction over offenders within Indigenous territories who are not members of Indian tribes, and the kind of debate that surrounded that effort, and the expressions of opposition by many members of Congress illustrates a lack of awareness of the issues, and a lack of will to some extent as well. So I think you find certainly both of those. I think that, moreover though, what Congress is in many ways a reflection of the general society in that regard. The lack of awareness we see among Congress has a lot to do with a lack of awareness by society, their voters. The voters, the people who vote Congress people into office, to the extent they do not care about these issues, you know, people in Congress will not care about them either.
Hi. This might be a bit of a strange question, but do you have any recommendations for literature, whether fiction or biography or memoir, that addresses Indigenous identity complexly?
I'm sorry, that addresses Indigenous?
Identity complexly. You talked about
And
stereotypes and, sorry?
That addresses Indigenous identity and
Complexly.
complexity.
No,
Some of our panelists, what would you recommend? Among the more recent ones. Yeah?
Actually, I wasn't really going to tout my own book there, Real Indians and Others, but no.
Yeah, these are the people who are much more qualified on those specific things.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a great number of, and I almost feel like I should pass it on to some of the other panelists who, I've been on sabbatical. My brain isn't as sharp. But yeah, I will have another question, but if somebody else would like to answer, you know.
George? Or Jeff Corntassel is here? I mean, okay, I was gonna say one, but Savage Anxieties by Robert Williams talks about Indigenous identity going back. I mean, attitudes towards Indigenous identity. Then he mirrors the discussion with attitudes about Indigenous identity with a discussion of identity from Indigenous people standpoints. He goes back into antiquity in that book about the attitudes towards Indigenous peoples, along the lines of what we've been talking about, what the lines I was just saying, these attitudes of otherness. And then he flips that and talks about Indigenous people's own conceptions about that. So I think it's really revealing, because much of these notions of identity have to do with perceptions as well as perceptions from the inside. So I think it's Penguin Press, I can't remember, but 2012, Savage Anxieties, Robert Williams. That's just a recent one that I would recommend. And if anybody else has one, I mean, the folks who were on the panel were talking about that, so I wanted to see if they wanted to contribute. But anyway, another question.
Yes, I have a couple of related questions about your work with the UN. There are many authoritarian governments, or semi-authoritarian in the world, who signed on to this declaration. And I'm wondering about who counts as an indigenous person, and might authoritarian governments not count some of their own people, like Tibetans in China? And second, who gets to represent indigenous authoritarian regimes? Do they have official people approved by the leading authorities rather than true representatives of the people themselves? And does that, on the one hand, you've got the declaration passed, but does that hurt implementation of actual measures?
Yeah, good question. No, there certainly are authoritarian regimes representing governments before the United Nations. But I would much honestly have those authoritarian regimes espouse affirmation of these rights than not, because at least you have a basis for which to try to hold them to standards that you might not otherwise have in a discussion with them. And there are countries that try to limit any kind of inquiry into what's happening in their countries by simply saying we don't have indigenous peoples or they're not indigenous. And you mentioned China and the Tibetans, the situation of Tibet. That's a complex one, because indeed the people from Tibet themselves, their leadership has not chosen to identify with the indigenous regime, even though, of course, literally they're indigenous to that place. But my experience with them is that and I've met with them. I had the privilege, the deep privilege of meeting with the Dalai Lama, and of course not denying that the indigenous character of his people. He and others explained to me that they saw their struggle as distinct. And in a very magnanimous way, explained to me how they didn't want their struggle and the controversies around it to be carried over into the indigenous movement, which had its own difficulties. Now, of course, there still are Tibetans who make the case that they're indigenous within the indigenous rights movement, and their views are their expressions are viewed with a lot of sympathy within the movement. But China is very resistant to having any scrutiny on groups within its borders on the basis of their being considered indigenous. And I had a number of conversations with the Chinese delegation to the UN in Geneva about that, and I didn't get very far with them. In fact, they tried to turn things on me and saying, look, we can hurt the whole system as it applies with regard to indigenous peoples, and your mandate in particular. You want us as your allies. So just let's try to. Their message was pretty clear in that regard. Russia has lately tried to control some of the representation of indigenous peoples accessing UN and other international meetings with limited success, I might add, when they've been called upon it. And As rapporteur, I addressed a communication to the Russian government raising concern about the closing down of the offices of one of the indigenous organizations and raising concern about possible manipulation and the way they were controlling access by indigenous people from there. And I don't want to take credit for this, but they eventually backed down. I think it was a number of different factors that led them to back down, but nonetheless, as you point out, that is a problem. The posture of the UN system itself, and certainly was my posture when working within it, was that it's not for governments to decide unilaterally who's indigenous or who's not. It's a matter primarily of self-identification by groups and of their being able to articulate the relevance of that self-identification to the various standards and programs of the United Nations. I never argued with any group that said they were indigenous. I mean, it's like, fine, you can say whatever you want. That's your prerogative. But if you're going to come to me as Special Rapporteur with a complaint, I want to hear what it is. And if you're the Afrikaners from South Africa and you just want to maintain privilege, well, I'm sorry, that's not a valid claim. You can call yourself indigenous if you want, but it doesn't get you get you to the point of maintaining your privilege. You see, so I would just move straight to applying the relevant human rights standards as opposed to quibble over whether or not a group is indigenous. Right here, yeah.
Hello. I have a friend who's working in sort of LGBTQ queer issues in his community. He's in his Navajo community, and a lot of the times he expresses sort of frustration on what he calls fighting a battle on two grounds. On the one hand, there's a struggle for developing a platform, a collective indigenous community identity from which to talk to sort of like the mainstream discourses that other them, and on the other hand, there's the him fighting within his community to change that very collective identity that he's working to secure, to accept him and his partner, and sort of like the many ways of recognizing a marriage within that community and his marriage being recognized. So like, I wonder if you could talk about sort of how to negotiate those two fronts, the creation of a collective identity, and on the other one, maintaining that identity sort of like flexible and fluid and mobile to include these other issues.
By indigenous peoples?
Yes, yes.
Well, cultures are dynamic, and I avoid talk about the preservation of culture because that's really not what it's about. It's to the extent there's preservation of anything, it's the identity, with an understanding that cultures are dynamic, and indigenous cultures are no exception, and they adapt and are open to adaptation, and over time have been very desirous even of doing so, of taking what can be learned from other cultures, adapting it, incorporating it, improving upon it, maybe disregarding if it doesn't work, and issues of individual identity and the issues you raised are part of that as well. I think that allowing for that space for the cultures to adapt and to understand that cultural identity is one value that has to be looked at within a universe of other human rights values. I mean, you'll see how in my presentation I tried to show how there's an interrelationship between these different values and they play off each other, and that's the only way they can be understood. And in affirming collective identity, it's a mistake to think that that's somehow denial of individual identity. It's not. The affirmation of collective identity is instrumental to the realization of human dignity for the individual in this context, and that's the way it's posited, and that's the way it's understood. And vice versa, the realization of individual worth feeds into and helps build that collective identity.
We can take one more question. And while we're waiting for them to take the mic to someone, I would just remind everybody that we will continue this conversation tomorrow at 10 a.m. in Pearson's, where we'll be talking about Indigenous peoples, the environment, and natural resources. So if someone has a last question for Professor Anaya.
Hello. Earlier you spoke about being able to use this treaty for countries that don't necessarily follow human rights to kind of as a backbone. What are some ways that the world is able to use this to enforce human rights? The treaty that you spoke about earlier.
I'm sorry. It's hard. The speakers are pointed that way, and so it's kind of muddled. What are the ways the world is able to use this being
The treaty.
the declaration?
I'm sorry. I call it a treaty. The declaration.
The declaration, yeah. You think of the declaration as an expression of ideas, and how do you use any idea? You repeat it, and you invoke it, and you argue it at every opportunity possible. And there are multiple opportunities within which to raise the declaration, including the way local governments work, the way they may or may not include in their educational programs an adequate reflection or accurate reflection of history as it relates to Indigenous peoples, the way individuals relate to each other in regard to their portrayal of Indigenous identities or adoption or not of stereotypes. I mean, the Declaration represents these ideas, and they can be invoked at every level of human interaction for the better, and that's the way it's intended to do. It's not some magical document or some document that represents a command that's automatically going to be implemented, and that's a mistake that people, I think, make when they think about the utility of international documents or instruments. Many of my students, law students, we try to get them to think like lawyers, but I mean in a good sense, not purging your brain of common sense. And so many of them think that, okay, we got this legal instrument, all you got to do is invoke it, stuff it in front of someone's face, and they're just going to say, okay, change. That's not the way it works. It's the power of that idea that's within the document that shapes minds and shapes thinking, and it's only then can you have change bring about, and that's the utility, and that's how you say the world, and I would say you, can use the Declaration.
Thank you very much.